The sonar operator heard the submarine before anyone else. He'd been listening to the sound of Marigold's own screws, the noise of depth charges settling, the groan of the sea, then something else, a propeller signature, slower, quieter, not fading in the distance as reported. Konkeng. Lieutenant William MacDonald, commanding the British corvette Marigold, had only been given permission to search for another 15 minutes. He'd already dropped one pattern of depth charges and heard nothing. The official assessment said the contact was probably gone. The sonar operator was saying different. MacDonald ordered another pattern, 10 depth charges this time. In the minutes that followed, something changed in the water below Marigold's hull. A German submarine that had been creeping through the Strait of Gibraltar toward the Mediterranean, 24 hours into what was supposed to be the most dangerous part of a one-way journey, rose toward the surface. The commander had decided to take his chances in the dark above. He was wrong. What happened next demonstrates something important about the nature of this war. Not just which side was winning, but what it cost to enter certain waters, and why some harbours never had an exit. Before October 1939, the British Royal Navy had something they called an impregnable anchorage. Scapa Flow, in the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. A broad, sheltered body of water almost completely surrounded by islands. The entrances were controlled by booms, anti-submarine nets, and sunken block ships. Multiple Royal Navy vessels had been lost trying to penetrate hostile harbours in the First World War. The lesson seemed clear. A properly defended anchorage was safe. Scapa Flow was where the home fleet rested between operations. The big ships, battleships, battlecruisers, carriers, anchored there in the knowledge that they were beyond reach. Anti-submarine patrols watched the approaches. Listening, stations monitored for engine noise. The defences weren't perfect, but they were comprehensive enough that no submarine commander would rationally attempt a penetration. The currents around the block ships were treacherous. The channels between the islands were shallow and unpredictable. A submerged approach was nearly impossible. Admiral Karl Dönitz looked at those defences and saw something different. He'd studied the photographs taken by a German reconnaissance flight over the islands. He saw a northern passageway through Kirk Sound, approximately 200 feet wide, between the sunken block ships Seriano and Numidian that hadn't been closed properly. A cable strung from the Seriano partially blocked it. The remaining block ship in that channel, SS Lake Neuchâtel, was still afloat when it was supposed to have been sunk. There was a gap. Not a wide one, not a safe one, but a gap. In his headquarters at Kiel, Dönitz wrote an assessment. I hold that a penetration at this point on the surface at the turn of the tide would be possible without further ceremony. He had a commander in mind for the job, and the commander he picked proved him exactly right. Gwenter Prien was 31 years old in October 1939. He'd already sunk 3 ships in the opening weeks of the war. Enough to be trusted, not enough to be irreplaceable. Dönitz briefed him in private and gave him the option to decline. Prien studied the photographs and charts overnight and accepted. U-47 departed Kiel on October 8, 1939. The crew didn't know the destination. Prien told them after they were underway. On the evening of October 13th, U-47 surfaced in the Pentland Firth and ran north at speed toward Kirk Sound. The night was supposed to be dark. What Prien found instead was the aurora borealis. The northern lights were spectacular that night, casting a pale luminescence across the calm water. The Orkneys were lit up. The submarine was visible on the surface for anyone on shore who happened to look. Prien pressed on. He had to. The tide wouldn't wait. Slack water was due 30 minutes before high tide at 11:30 in the evening, the only window when the treacherous currents through Kirk Sound would be manageable. His chart showed the way through, between the Seriano and the shore, through the northern 200 feet of the channel. As U-47 edged into Kirk Sound on electric motors, the problem with charts became apparent. The bow grounded. The stern swung onto the cable strung from the Seriano. Prien blew his forward ballast tanks and U-47 lurched free, nosing through the gap with the conning tower, clearing the block ship by a margin that nobody wanted to calculate. A few turns to avoid grounding again. Then, open water. Prien entered a line in the log at 12:27 in the morning. "We're in Scapa Flow." We are in Scapa Flow. What he found inside was a shock of a different kind. He'd expected to find the jewels of the Royal Navy. Battleships, battle cruisers, carriers, dozens of targets. He found an almost empty anchorage. An order from Fleet Admiral Forbes, issued a week earlier, had dispersed most of the home fleet to other ports over fear of air attack. Prien cruised the anchorage for an hour and a half, searching. 51 vessels were at anchor, but most were auxiliaries and support ships. Of the major warships, only one was immediately apparent: a Royal Navy battleship lying at anchor 4,400 yards from the northeast shore. Try to picture what that hour and a half looked like from U-47's bridge. You're inside the Royal Navy's home anchorage. The Aurora Borealis is lighting up the sky. British ships are anchored all around you. The shore is close enough that you can see lights. You're on the surface. The only way to move fast enough and quietly enough to find a target and get out before dawn. Any vessel that spots a submarine silhouette in this anchorage is going to raise an alarm that will seal the exit before you can reach it. You've been here 90 minutes. You haven't found the target you came for. The clock is running because the tide will not wait, and the northern sky will not stay dark much longer. In a film recording made after the raid, Prien described the view as absolutely dead calm. The entire bay was alight because of bright northern lights. We then cruised in the bay for approximately 1.5 hours, chose our targets. He didn't record how that hour and a half felt. In the village of St. Mary's, only 850 yards away, a dance was still in full swing. Crew members on U-47's deck could see it. He'd wanted Repulse, Hood, Rodney. What he had was Royal Oak, an older ship, slower, retrofitted with torpedo blisters that had been designed to withstand a torpedo warhead of 450 to 500 pounds. The newer German G7 torpedoes carried over 600 pounds of explosive. Prien didn't know about that particular detail. He fired anyway. 3 torpedoes at 12:58 in the morning. One glancing hit on Royal Oak's anchor cable. The explosion shook the ship and woke the crew. But a tannoy announcement told everyone to check magazine temperatures. The working theory was an internal accident. Many sailors went back to their hammocks. Prien, startled that the attack hadn't raised an alarm, turned around and reloaded. At 1:23 in the morning, he fired 3 more torpedoes. All 3 hit. Royal Oak's magazine exploded. She rolled over and sank in 13 minutes. 833 men died, including 135 boy sailors, some of them not yet 18 years old. Think about that number for a moment. 135 boys under 18 on a battleship at anchor in what was supposed to be the safest anchorage in the British Navy at 1 in the morning on a Scottish night in October, who had no idea what hit them until the second salvo, and by then had 13 minutes. The survivors' accounts describe men trying to climb down the rolling hull as the ship went over, men swallowing fuel oil from the burst bunkers, men swimming half a mile in freezing dark water toward the shore. Royal Marine Horace Baber had woken to the first explosion, been told it was probably internal, gone back to sleep, and was thrown from his hammock by the second salvo. He spent the rest of the night on a trawler packed with survivors. Paymaster Lieutenant Commander Eardley McLean had been awake watching the northern lights when he heard the first explosion. He made it to a ship's boat in the water, climbed in, started pulling others out. The boat capsized twice under the weight of men clinging to it. McLean found himself in the water with oil coating his mouth, trying to right the boat while more men arrived. Those who made it out found themselves in dark, water thick with fuel oil, half a mile from shore, in October in Scotland. Most of the men who went in didn't come out. Prien exited through the southern part of Kirk Sound, passing between two more block ships, and cleared Scapa Flow at 2:15 in the morning. He was back in Germany before the sun had fully risen on the damage he'd done. The propaganda was immediate. Prien and his crew were flown to Berlin for an audience with Hitler. Every crew member received the Iron Cross. Prien became the first German submarine officer to receive the Knight's Cross. He was called the Bull of Scapa Flow, the commander who had entered the impregnable anchorage and walked out the other side. The British began sinking more block ships immediately. By 1940, the Churchill barriers were under construction. Massive permanent causeways that would block the eastern approaches to Scapa Flow completely. The reconnaissance photographs had shown Donitz a gap. That gap was now being filled, expensively, with steel and concrete, in a project that took the labor of thousands of Italian prisoners of war and would eventually link the islands permanently by road. What the photographs had shown, a physical gap in the block ships. What they couldn't show, the luck involved in getting through it. U-47 had grounded. It had swung onto a cable. It had cleared obstacles by margins that Prien, in his post-war account, admitted were narrower than he'd expected. One slightly different current, one slightly different approach angle, and U-47 would have been wedged between the Seriano and the shore, unable to surface, unable to dive, unable to back out. The crew would have drowned in a submarine hull visible from the Orkney shoreline. And even the men who survived the night didn't all survive the war. U-47 made 10 patrols total, sinking 30 ships and more than 160,000 tons of Allied shipping. On March 7, 1941, the boat sent its last radio message from the North Atlantic near the Rockall Banks and never transmitted again. The British destroyer Wolverine kept up a sustained depth charge attack on a contact that day. What remains certain is that U-47 never surfaced again. Gwenthar Prien, the Bull of Scapa Flow, went down with his boat and all his crew. He was 32 years old. If Scapa Flow was a harbour that could be entered once and never again, the Strait of Gibraltar was a passage that could be entered but never exited the same way. The strait is the only opening between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. At its narrowest point, near Gibraltar itself, it's only 8 miles wide. The current runs primarily east, from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, which gave submerged submarines a potential advantage. Drift in silently on electric motors. Let the current carry you through the centre. The British couldn't close the strait entirely. No net was practical across a channel that deep and that wide. Their defence was something more diffuse. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft flying continuously from Gibraltar, surface ships running constant sweeps, listening posts, and the simple fact that 8 miles isn't very much room to hide a submarine. From September 1941 to May 1944, Germany sent 62 U-boats into the Mediterranean. 9 were sunk attempting the Gibraltar Passage. 10 more took damage severe enough to force them back to French bases. The 27 that successfully passed in 1941 alone did so with a combination of darkness, silence, deep running, and the specific topography of the strait's current. Here's what the crossing looked like in practice. Your orders say to approach closely at night, dive to depth, shut down every system that makes noise, cut your speed to almost nothing, and drift on the Atlantic current through the center of the strait. The current is running east at about 3 knots, which helps. You're trying to pass a point where the water is only about 1,000 feet deep at most, through a channel 8 miles wide at its narrowest, while radar-equipped aircraft fly overhead and surface ships run sonar sweeps in patterns designed specifically to catch submarines, doing exactly what you're doing. The passage takes hours. You can't speed it up without making noise. You can't surface to check your position. You navigate by dead reckoning and prayer, in a steel tube, in the dark, knowing that if you're detected at any point in that passage, There's nowhere to go. You can't turn around. You can't surface safely. You can't outrun a destroyer on electric motors at 3 knots. The first wave of boats to make the crossing in September and October 1941 mostly succeeded. The British defences hadn't fully adapted yet. By November and December, things were different. The defences had been reinforced. More aircraft, more ships, better radar. Every successful crossing gave Allied intelligence more information about how the Germans were doing it, which made each subsequent attempt more dangerous. And behind all of it, waiting, was the knowledge that every commander who received these orders knew. Whatever happened in the passage, there was no coming back. Here's the number that defined the campaign. Not one of the 62 submarines that entered the Mediterranean ever made it back through the strait to the Atlantic. Not a single one. The passage was a one-way door. Every commander who received orders to transit Gibraltar knew, or should have known, that he would never see the Atlantic again. Admiral Dönitz knew this better than most. He had been an officer aboard UB-68 when it was sunk in the Mediterranean in the First World War. He was not enthusiastic about sending his boats back into those waters. The Mediterranean was clear and calm compared to the North Atlantic. No weather to hide in, no fog, water visibility that made submerged submarines easier to spot from the air. He considered each boat sent there permanently lost to the Atlantic battle. He was right. He sent them anyway because Hitler and the High Command wanted U-boats supporting the Italian Navy and the campaign in North Africa. What Dönitz wanted and what Berlin ordered were frequently different things. Hans I was 26 years old and on his first war patrol in command when he received orders to take U-433 through the Strait of Gibraltar. He had only one Atlantic patrol to his credit as commander, and he hadn't sunk a ship. The decision to send less experienced commanders had come because the more experienced ones were needed in the Atlantic, and because after the early successes in the Mediterranean, U-81's sinking of the carrier Ark Royal in November 1941 being the most dramatic, Berlin had decided the Mediterranean was manageable. A passed through the strait on November 15th, 1941. One day later, he was 30 miles east of Europa Point, south of Malaga, barely inside the Mediterranean, when his watch crew spotted the corvette Marigold running without lights. I attacked. He fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 missed. Marigold immediately turned toward where the torpedoes had come from, which was standard doctrine, the attacker's likely position. In the control room of U-433, A ordered the hydrophones switched off in anticipation of the first depth charge pattern. The British dropped 5 charges. Nothing decisive. The charges stopped. The hydrophones came back on. I and his officers listened. Propeller noise. Fading. The corvette seemed to be leaving. What had actually happened? Marigold had slowed and turned, in the dark, listening. The corvette's captain, Lieutenant MacDonald, asked for 15 more minutes. His sonar operator was hearing something that didn't match the sound of a contact running away. The depth charges had pushed U-433 into a slight change of course, and the boat's noise signature was different from what the initial contact had suggested. 10 depth charges dropped on the correct bearing. In U-433's control room, the explosions were close enough to damage equipment and shake the crew. I and his officers began debating what to do next. The crew, hearing the discussion, reportedly pushed for staying submerged, waiting it out, running batteries flat if necessary. A decided to surface instead, take advantage of the dark, and try to escape on the surface. This decision, according to interrogation records, the crew blamed on their commander afterward. At 21:55, U-433 broke the surface. Marigold, which had not left, spotted the submarine immediately dead astern. The corvette opened fire with everything it had: 4-inch gun, Lewis guns, pom-pom cannon. Tracers hit the conning tower. I's crew heard them before they saw them. The submarine's engineer officer supervised setting scuttling charges on a 10-minute timer. The crew abandoned ship. U-433, engines still running, plowed in circles through the men in the water before the scuttling charges detonated. 6 of I's crew died. 38 survived. A Among them, Marigold pulled the survivors out of the water and took them to Gibraltar. A had been inside the Mediterranean for 1 day. Gerd Schreiber was a different kind of commander than A. He was a veteran. U-9. 5 had completed 6 Atlantic patrols before the Mediterranean orders came, sinking 8 ships totaling 28,000 tons. Schreiber knew how to handle a submarine in hostile waters. He passed through the strait successfully on November 26th and put some distance between himself and Gibraltar. 2 days in the Mediterranean. Just enough time to start thinking the worst was over. On November 28th, the hydrophone operator on U-9-5 picked up a submarine contact. This was unexpected. U-9-5 was in friendly waters now. Italian and German forces operated throughout this area. Schreiber went to battle stations, approached the contact, tried to identify it. He made 3 separate approaches, each undetected. He aborted each one because he wasn't sure. The silhouette looked like it might be a friendly submarine. He didn't want to fire on an ally. On the 4th approach, he made a decision. He flashed the current German recognition signal. The contact was the Dutch submarine O-21, returning to Gibraltar from a luckless patrol off the Italian coast. Commander Johannes Franz van Dulm on the bridge of O-21 saw a submarine flashing a German recognition code. Van Dulm went to battle stations. He fired a stern torpedo, missed. His second stern torpedo hit U-9-5 and broke her apart. Van Dulm picked up Schreiber, 3 officers and 8 men from the wreckage. 35 of U-9-5's crew were dead. Van Dulm took the survivors to Gibraltar, the same port they had passed through 2 days earlier to enter the Mediterranean. Schreiber was imprisoned at Gibraltar. A, whose boat had been sunk 12 days earlier, was already there. 2 German submarine commanders, sitting in a British prison on the Rock of Gibraltar, both of whom had entered the Mediterranean and found the exit already closed behind them. They did what prisoners do. They planned an escape. The details of the Schreiber I escape are sparse in the historical record. What is documented? Both men escaped from their imprisonment at Gibraltar, intending to cross the Spanish border and make their way to Germany through neutral Spain. They were recaptured shortly after escaping. Both were sent to London. The irony is specific and worth sitting with. These were 2 commanders who had successfully entered what was supposed to be a one-way passage through the most heavily defended strait in the world. They had survived the sinking of their submarines. They had survived capture. They had escaped a British military prison on a piece of rock 2.5 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide, with the Spanish border less than a mile away, in territory so contested and surveilled that German agents watched the shipping lanes from the Spanish side. And still, they were caught. Of the 62 submarines that entered the Mediterranean, the closest any boat came to returning to the Atlantic was U-573. A Royal Air Force Hudson aircraft caught it in May 1942 while it was still in the Western Mediterranean, badly damaged it, and forced it to the surface. Unable to dive, and unable to make it back through the strait, U-573 limped into the nearest neutral port, which was Cartagena in Spain. The Spanish interned the submarine and the crew. Several years later, they bought the boat from the Germans and put it into service in the Spanish Navy as the G7. It served until 1971, when it was sold for scrap. That is the only U-boat from the Mediterranean campaign that technically survived, and it did so by becoming someone else's submarine. The Scapa Flow raid and the Gibraltar campaign seem, on the surface, like different stories. One was a single spectacular penetration, a deliberate attempt to enter an anchorage and escape. The other was a sustained attempt to push 62 submarines through a contested strait and lose all of them. What they share is the same fundamental truth about entering heavily defended waters. You can find the gap in the defences. Gwenther Preen found the gap in the block ships at Kirk Sound. The 62 boats in the Mediterranean found the gap in the Gibraltar defences well enough to pass through on the current, in silence, in the dark. Getting through doesn't mean getting out. Preen got out once and was celebrated for it, and then went back to sea and didn't come back. The submarines in the Mediterranean got through the strait and found themselves in water that was clear and warm and patrolled from 100 different directions, with no weather to hide in and no way back. The British Navy did not make those waters impenetrable. They made the cost of operating in them unsustainable. Every harbour that seemed like a target had escorts. Every strait that seemed crossable had a patrol aircraft above it with radar. Every gap in the defences was slightly narrower than it looked on the reconnaissance photographs. The gap at Kirk Sound had a cable that Preen had to blow his ballast tanks to clear. The gap in the Gibraltar defences had the Dutch submarine O-21 running back to port, which happened to be exactly where the German recognition signal worked against the man who flashed it. And there's a third pattern running through both stories, quieter than the rest. After Preen entered Scapa Flow, the British built the Churchill barriers, permanent causeways across the eastern approaches, finally closing what the block ships had only half closed. After the Gibraltar campaign, Allied intelligence studied every passage attempt, every attack, every sinking, and used the data to tighten the defences further. Every time a German submarine found a gap and proved it existed, the gap was filled. Not always immediately, not always cheaply, but closed. The harbour that Schreiber and I escaped from at Gibraltar, the prison on the rock, they made it over the wall and couldn't get through Spain. The harbour they'd tried to transit through twice, on their submarines, one of them successfully. They made it through the strait and couldn't get back. The title of this story is not a metaphor. It describes, fairly precisely, what happened to every German submarine commander who received orders to enter the Mediterranean. They entered a harbour and never found the exit, because the exit had been the same gap as the entrance, and once the British knew you'd used it, they closed it behind you. Royal Oak is still down there. She lies upside down in 30 metres of water in the northeast corner of Scapa Flow, in position marked by a buoy. Oil from her bunkers still seeps slowly to the surface after more than 80 years. The Royal Navy declared her a war grave immediately after the sinking. Every year, on October 14th, a Navy dive team lowers a white ensign to her hull in remembrance. The crew is still inside. 833 men, including 135 boys under 18. They've been there since the morning of October 14th, 1939. They'll be there long after the last person alive, who remembers that night, is gone. Gwenther Preen and the crew of U-47 lie somewhere else entirely. The North Atlantic, near Rockall Banks, in water deep enough that they'll never be found. Preen entered Scapa Flow and escaped. He did everything right. He found the gap. He threaded through it. He sank the ship. He got out in the dark. The most audacious harbour penetration in submarine history, and he pulled it off completely. He didn't survive the war by 17 months. The harbour he couldn't escape from was the North Atlantic itself.